As the plane finally leveled off into cruising altitude, the cabin returned to a state of calm. The hum of the engines filled the space, blending with the low murmur of passengers chatting and settling back into their seats. What had started as a tense and awkward encounter had now become a story that many on board wouldn't forget anytime soon. The man adjusted his tie and glanced out of the window, taking in the vast expanse of clouds. A part of him was still processing everything that had happened. The blatant injustice, the confrontation, and the eventual resolution. He hadn't intended to make a scene, but standing his ground had clearly made a difference. A flight attendant, different from the one involved earlier, approached him with a warm smile. "Sir, on behalf of the crew, I just want to thank you for your patience. Can I get you a complimentary drink or snack?" She offered kindly. He nodded politely. "I'll take a water, thanks." Nearby passengers gave him subtle nods of acknowledgement, silent gestures of support and respect. A woman across the aisle leaned over and whispered, "Good for you. You handled that better than most of us would have." He smiled modestly, just wanted what was fair. Meanwhile, the senior flight attendant quietly informed the disruptive crew member that she would not be serving for the remainder of the flight. The embarrassed woman nodded stiffly, retreating to the back of the plane. The message was clear: favoritism and disrespect had no place here. As the flight continued smoothly, the man reflected on how one small moment of standing firm had sparked a ripple effect. It wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about dignity and fairness. Sometimes speaking up was necessary not just for yourself, but for the principle of what was right. When the plane finally landed and passengers began gathering their belongings, several people stopped to shake his hand or offer a kind word as they filed past. He accepted their words graciously, never making a fuss. As he stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the crisp airport air greeted him like a reset button. The journey had been anything but ordinary, but it was over now. Life would go on, as it always did, but one thing was certain: courage in the face of unfairness could leave a lasting mark. Sometimes all it took was refusing to give up your rightful seat. And that simple act, it was worth every second. The cabin fell silent as the woman's bold statement echoed through the aisle. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances, wondering what she meant by being promised the seat. Even the captain appeared taken aback, though he quickly masked his surprise with a composed expression. The man stayed seated, his brows furrowing as the pieces began falling into place. Something about this entire situation wasn't adding up. He turned his attention back to the flight attendant in sunglasses, whose body language had shifted to discomfort. Her confidence from earlier was now replaced with visible unease. The captain cleared his throat, addressing the woman directly. "Ma'am, may I ask who made such a promise to you?" His tone was polite but firm, signaling that this was about to come to a head. The woman hesitated, glancing nervously at the flight attendant, before blurting out, "She did. She said this seat was mine because I'm a loyal customer." Her voice wavered, and it was clear that the confident facade she had maintained earlier was beginning to crack. Murmurs spread throughout the cabin as passengers realized the gravity of what had just been revealed. The man, still seated, let out a slow breath, finally understanding what was really going on. This wasn't about any mistake or emergency. It was about favoritism, plain and simple. The captain's jaw tightened. "Thank you for your honesty," he said curtly before turning back to the flight attendant. "Is this true?" The flight attendant's face flushed. She stammered, searching for an explanation. I was just trying to provide exceptional service. She's a VIP member," she insisted weakly. The captain's voice grew firmer. "Exceptional service doesn't mean violating policies or disrespecting other passengers," he said. This gentleman booked and paid for this seat. Asking him to move without justification was unacceptable. Turning toward the man, the captain offered an apologetic nod. "Sir, I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience. Please remain in your seat." The woman, now humiliated, returned to her original seat without another word, her entitlement completely deflated. The flight attendant stood frozen, knowing what was coming. "We'll be addressing this situation formally once we land," the captain added grimly. As he walked back toward the front of the plane, passengers broke into scattered applause. The man allowed himself a small smile, grateful that justice had prevailed. Just as things seemed to settle, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We've encountered an unexpected delay, but I assure you it has nothing to do with seating arrangements this time." Laughter rippled through the cabin, the tension finally lifting. The man leaned back in his seat, ready for the journey ahead. Little did anyone know, this flight would be remembered for far more than its destination. The flight attendant hesitated for a fraction of a second before turning on her heel and marching back up the aisle. It was obvious she intended to make good on her threat. The air felt electric with anticipation as everyone waited to see what would happen next. No one knew just how far this would go, but one thing was certain: this flight was already unforgettable. The flight attendant stormed toward the front of the plane, her steps quick and purposeful. The tension hanging over the cabin only grew thicker as passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Many had seen disagreements on flights before, but this was different. It felt personal, as though something more was at play beneath the surface. The man adjusted his sunglasses, staying composed despite the mounting pressure. He knew things were about to escalate, but walking away from this would set a precedent he wasn't willing to accept. "They can't just push people around like this," he thought to himself, glancing toward the other passengers who were silently rooting for him. Moments later, the unexpected happened. The captain himself appeared at the front of the aisle, flanked by the flight attendant who had issued the original demand. His presence sent a ripple through the cabin. This was rare. Captains didn't usually leave the cockpit unless things were serious. Passengers sat up straighter, their eyes glued to the unfolding scene. The captain walked with authority, but his expression was surprisingly calm. He stopped just short of the man's row, his voice steady yet firm. "Good afternoon, sir," he said politely. "I've been briefed on the situation. It seems there's been some misunderstanding regarding seat assignments." The man met his gaze calmly. "No misunderstanding on my end, Captain," he said evenly. "I booked this seat, paid for it, and was told to move without any clear reason. I'm simply asking for an explanation." The captain nodded thoughtfully. "I understand, and I appreciate your patience." He shot a quick glance at the flight attendant, whose face was growing increasingly tense. "We do our best to accommodate all passengers fairly," the captain continued, "but I'll need a moment to review what's happened here." As the captain spoke, something shifted in the atmosphere. The woman who had been silent throughout the ordeal suddenly stood up. Her heels clicked against the cabin floor as she approached the group. There was an unmistakable air of entitlement in her posture, as though she had finally decided it was time to take control of the situation. "I'm sorry, but this is just ridiculous," she said loudly, her voice carrying across the rows of passengers. "I was promised this seat, and I expect the staff to honor that." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Promised? By whom? The twist raised more questions than answers, and suddenly the tension wasn't just between the man and the crew. It was about something bigger. The captain's expression shifted ever so slightly, as though he was beginning to piece together the true story. Whatever was happening, it was clear this flight was far from ordinary. and no one knew what bombshell would drop next. As the flight attendant disappeared toward the front, the buzz of conversations filled the cabin. Some passengers shook their heads in disbelief. Others leaned over to exchange hushed opinions with their seatmates. The situation had become the unexpected drama of the flight, and everyone seemed invested in how it would play out. The man adjusted his suit jacket, glancing briefly around the cabin. He noticed sympathetic nods from a few nearby passengers, silently affirming that they were on his side. It was reassuring, but he knew this wasn't just about public perception. It was about principles. He had every right to be in that seat, and no one had given him a reasonable explanation for why he should leave it. A couple seated across the aisle whispered to each other, their curiosity piqued. "Why is she even asking him to move?" the woman muttered. Her partner shrugged, clearly just as confused. "Probably some mix-up," he replied, though his tone hinted he didn't believe that either. Meanwhile, up front, the flight attendant was speaking urgently to another crew member, gesturing subtly toward the back where the man remained seated. From his vantage point, he could see her growing frustration. The situation wasn't going the way she planned, and it was clear she wasn't used to passengers pushing back so firmly. Back in the cabin, tension simmered as more people began to take sides in their minds. The woman who was supposed to take the man's seat still hadn't said a word. Her silence was louder than anything she could have spoken. She sat with an air of entitlement, as if waiting for things to be handled in her favor without needing to lift a finger. A flight attendant with a different demeanor, older and with a more composed presence, walked toward the man. Her smile was polite but strained, revealing that she had been briefed on the situation. "Sir," she began kindly, "we're just trying to accommodate everyone and ensure a smooth flight experience." The man didn't flinch. "I understand that," he said calmly, "but no one has told me why I'm being asked to give up my seat. Is there a specific reason?" The flight attendant hesitated, glancing back toward her colleague, who stood stiffly near the galley. For a brief moment, it was clear that even she didn't entirely agree with how this was being handled. The unresolved tension lingered in the air as passengers continued to watch intently. The standoff wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier with each passing second. Conversations that had filled the air earlier began to quiet down as passengers watched the unfolding scene. The man sat firmly in his seat, his expression calm but resolute. He wasn't about to back down without a legitimate reason, and that determination was written all over his face. The senior flight attendant, who had approached earlier, was now visibly uncomfortable. It was clear she had been thrown into a mess she hadn't created. She offered a diplomatic smile, hoping to diffuse the situation. "We really appreciate your cooperation, sir," she said in a measured tone. "If we can make any accommodations for you afterward, we'd be happy to do so." But the man wasn't buying it. "I paid for this seat, fair and square," he responded politely but firmly. "All I'm asking is why I'm being asked to move. Is there some emergency or special circumstance?" His voice carried just enough authority to make the crew pause. Passengers leaned forward, straining to hear every word. Some discreetly recorded this scene on their phones, anticipating that this was more than just a routine disagreement. The woman for whom this seat swap was being orchestrated remained composed, her expression cool and unaffected. She didn't even glance toward the man, as though this whole ordeal had nothing to do with her. A sharp announcement crackled over the intercom, momentarily breaking the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask for your patience as we finalize preparations for departure," the captain's voice said smoothly, though his tone hinted that he, too, was aware of the brewing drama. Just then, the flight attendant in sunglasses returned, her expression hardened. She walked briskly toward the man and leaned down, speaking in a hushed but forceful tone. "Sir, if you don't comply, we may need to escalate this further," she warned, clearly attempting to assert control over the situation. The man met her gaze without flinching. "Escalate it," he said evenly. "Go ahead." His refusal to budge sent a ripple of tension through the cabin. Behind him, a few passengers muttered in quiet support. One man whispered, "He's right. This is ridiculous." Another nodded in agreement. It was clear that people were beginning to see this, not just as an isolated incident, but as a matter of principle. What if a simple flight turned into an unforgettable showdown? Imagine being asked to give up your seat for no good reason, just because someone else supposedly deserves it more. That's exactly what happened to one man when a flight attendant crossed the line, sparking a chain of events no one expected. It was supposed to be a peaceful business class flight. Our main character, a confident and well-dressed man ready to enjoy his trip, had settled into his seat when things took an unexpected turn. Out of nowhere, a flight attendant approached with a strange request. "We need you to switch seats," she insisted, pointing to a woman nearby. There was no polite explanation, no valid reason, just a demand that didn't sit right. The situation quickly grew tense. Passengers around them started watching, their curiosity piqued by this sudden commotion. The man, calm yet firm, questioned why he was being asked to move. His rightful spot had been booked and paid for, after all. But the flight attendant wouldn't back down. "It's for her," she said vaguely, as if that justified everything. Despite the awkward atmosphere, the man stood his ground. Something just didn't feel right. Why was he being singled out? Why was this woman's comfort prioritized over his without any clear reason? But as this heated standoff continued, it became clear that this wasn't just about a seat. It was about standing up for fairness and respect. Little did anyone know, this moment would backfire on the flight attendant in a way she never saw coming. What happened next shook the entire flight and changed the course of that journey forever. So how did this standoff end? Did the man move, or did he hold firm? And what consequences awaited the flight attendant, who thought she had all the power? Stay tuned, because this is just the beginning of a story filled with surprising twists and lessons about dignity, equality, and doing what's right. The air inside the plane was thick with tension. Passengers whispered among themselves, some glancing over nervously, while others openly stared at the unfolding scene. The man, composed but clearly unsettled, kept his calm demeanor as he tried to make sense of the situation. He had boarded early, placed his carry-on in the overhead bin, and settled into the premium seat he had reserved well in advance. It was supposed to be a smooth, comfortable journey. But here he was, being told to move, without a clear reason. The flight attendant in the sleek blue uniform stood her ground, sunglasses still perched firmly on her face, as if to hide her true intentions. "Please, sir, it's better if you cooperate," she insisted in a firm but dismissive tone. Her voice carried an air of authority that was starting to wear thin on the man's patience. Meanwhile, the woman for whom this whole spectacle was unfolding remained seated a few rows away, seemingly oblivious to the stir being caused on her behalf. She adjusted her designer handbag on her lap and glanced at her phone, not showing any sign of surprise or discomfort. It was as if this kind of privilege was something she had come to expect. Passengers exchanged puzzled looks, wondering why a person who had paid for a specific seat was being pressured to give it up without warning. A few began shifting in their seats, visibly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Some murmured quietly, questioning whether this was a case of special treatment for one passenger at the expense of another. The man knew he wasn't just standing up for himself at this point. He was standing up for something bigger. Still, he kept his tone measured, refusing to be provoked. "I'm sorry, but I'm staying in my seat. I paid for this spot just like everyone else here," he said firmly. His voice was calm but resolute. The flight attendant's expression hardened. It was clear she hadn't expected him to push back. A few moments passed in awkward silence before she finally turned and walked briskly toward the front of the cabin, seemingly to get someone higher up involved. The other passengers remained on edge, sensing that this situation was far from over. What exactly was going on? Why was this woman being prioritized? And how would this standoff end? Everyone could feel that something big was about to happen.